Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar entitled Demystifying Islamophobia, Anti-Palestinian Racism and Antisemitism, Building Shared Understandings. My name is James Cairns, and I'm a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies, Law and Social Justice at Laurier. I will be moderating tonight's discussion among four leading experts in their respective fields: Dalia El Farra, Jasmine Zine, Cheryl Nestle, and Alejandro Paz. I'll say more about each speaker in the web format in a few minutes. I just want to note that recording or sharing this event on your own device is strictly prohibited, although you'll note that we are recording the event. But first, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes framing tonight's discussion in relation to global movements for decolonization and defending and promoting academic freedom and free expression on campus. I want to begin tonight's event by recognizing that Wilfrid Laurier University, both in Waterloo and in Brantford, operates on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. This panel is being hosted on land covered by the Haldeman Treaty of 1784, which acknowledges that the Haldeman Tract is the territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River in perpetuity. The Haldeman Tract runs 6 miles deep on either side of the Grand River from its source in the Dunlop Highlands, about 300 kilometers south to the mouth at Lake Erie. Today, less than 5% of the Haldeman Tract remains in Six Nations hands. The colonial land grabs began almost immediately after the Haldeman Treaty was signed. A combination of government and legal decisions, unsanctioned white settlement backed by state and vigilante violence, and unscrupulous land deals shifted huge amounts of the Haldeman Tract into private settler hands, placed them under the ownership of settler corporations, and clawed them back under colonial authority. I stand in solidarity with movements for decolonization across Turtle Island, including local land back struggles in Brantford, Brant County, Haldeman County, and elsewhere. And in these horrific months of Israel's ongoing genocidal war against Palestinians, it seems to me necessary for people committed to decolonization in Canada to ask what that demands of us in response to Palestinian calls for international solidarity with campaigns for freedom and a just and lasting peace in historic Palestine. Palestinian scholars and activists, along with scholars and activists indigenous to Turtle Island, have said very clearly, we are at a crucial moment in the history of Palestinian dispossession and the expansion of Israel's 76-year settler colonial project. This is not to minimize the violence faced by Israeli citizens and others on October 7th. It is rather to talk seriously about dismantling structures of violence that have dispossessed Palestinians of lives, freedom, and political rights and land, going back to Britain's Balfour Declaration of 1917. Last October, leading Indigenous thinkers, scholars, artists, and activists from around the world issued the Indigenous Solidarity with Palestine statement. The statement reads in part, quote, "The atrocities of the Israeli apartheid regime in Palestine are relentless, illegal under international law, and consistent with settler colonial projects globally. It has been heartbreaking and unsurprising to see the colonial powers in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe line up behind this genocide. Israeli settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation are only possible because of international support." Universities across Turtle Island, including Laurier, have officially committed to decolonial efforts. These commendable efforts require extending the conversation beyond Turtle Island in keeping with the interconnected nature of these global oppressions and struggles. In December, the government of South Africa brought charges of genocide against the State of Israel to the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands. The case currently before the court documents the staggering scale of Israel's assault on Palestinian civilians and objects protected by international law. In the past 5 months, the Israeli military has killed more than 30,000 Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip and wounded more than 70,000 others. Hundreds more have been killed and wounded by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. And it's worth noting that in the first 9 months of 2023, that is before October 7th, Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank killed 241 Palestinians. The rights of dissenting Arabs and Jews inside Israel have been repeatedly overrun. Israel has bombed every hospital and every university in the Gaza Strip. It bombs UN-run schools and refugee camps, ambulance convoys, water purification plants, power plants. In November, Gaza's only functioning wheat mill was flattened. Israel has destroyed more than 100 mosques in Gaza. It's destroyed 70% of homes in Gaza. Something like 1.5 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced by the Israeli military, either through bombs or military orders, most fleeing to the southern part of the Strip, which Israel only recently declared a safe zone, yet now promises to attack imminently. As we meet tonight, Israel's siege of Gaza, which didn't start after October 7th, but is rather an intensification of the blockade imposed on Gaza since 2007. This siege is, at this moment, preventing the necessary food and water from reaching civilians in the very territory that the Israeli military occupies. In the words of the Palestinian-American lawyer and professor Noura Erakat, quote, "We have spent the last 4.5 months witnessing images of children asphyxiated from homes collapsed on top of them. Now we are witnessing images of babies, children, and adults who have starved to death or could not survive because of severe dehydration," end quote. Over the past months on campuses and everywhere across Turtle Island, there's been a powerful surge of protest against Israel's genocidal war. Student walkouts, mass demonstrations, teach-ins, building occupations, new boycott, divestment, sanction campaigns. The growing Palestine solidarity movement includes major labor unions, churches, mosques, anti-Zionist Jewish groups such as Independent Jewish Voices, which is one of today's panel sponsors, Jewish Voices for Peace, Jewish students and academic workers saying, "Not in our name," as well as a host of other civil society organizations. Notably, Faculty for Palestine, a network of roughly 800 university and college professors across Turtle Island, has helped build the campaign against scholasticide in Gaza and for robust academic freedom on campuses in Canada. It's the strength of this broad, diverse movement that is opening up space on campuses to talk about the contemporary and historical situation in Israel-Palestine, and to criticize Canada's complicity in Israel's war today and with 75 years of settler colonialism. And while there's much work to be done to break with Israeli apartheid, it's the power of this movement to date that forced the Canadian government to abandon its anti-ceasefire position at the United Nations and appears to be about to force Canada to resume its funding to UNRWA. One of the great barriers to this movement in the Canadian context is the aggressive silencing campaign against Palestinian solidarity. This is something that my dear friends and colleagues, Mary Jo Nadeau and Alan Sears, wrote about more than 10 years ago in Studies in Political Economy, and which one of today's panelists, Dr. Cheryl Nestle, revisited in the latest issue of Topia. Nadeau and Sears analyzed long-standing efforts to shut down effective expressions of Palestine solidarity, tracing the core strategy of silencing to deep roots in the specific history of Palestinian unfreedom, which is centered around sustained efforts to erase Palestinian existence. I'm sure other panelists will provide many examples, but to give just one example highlighting the institutional power of the silencing campaign today, simply recall that Ontario's Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, doxed pro-Palestinian faculty and students on the floor of the Legislative Assembly last fall. The attempt to intimidate could hardly be cruder. As you may know, there's been an organized campaign to slander panelists on tonight's webinar and force Laurier's administrators to shut down this event. We are grateful for the groundswell of community support defending the webinar and free expression on Palestine, and we're grateful for Laurier administration's refusal to give in to the silencing campaign. We need more discussion about these vital issues, not less, and university campuses must remain spaces where critical ideas are freely shared. Every day there are mass media reports about heightened anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campuses. Tonight's panel contextualizes, historicizes, and critically unpacks these concepts to provide a deeper and more nuanced understanding of these forms of oppression and their various manifestations. Tonight's panel is one contribution, and I want to emphasize only one, and not the last, to the ongoing task of collectively deciding how we can talk most clearly about these issues while keeping all students and academic workers safe, while promoting free expression, upholding and protecting academic freedom, and while fighting genocide and supporting struggles for decolonization in Palestine, on Turtle Island, and everywhere. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank the 14 campus and community organizations that sponsored tonight's panel. The panel has been endorsed by Laurier's anthropology program, community psychology field, the cultural studies program, the cultural analysis and social theory MA program, Faculty for Palestine's Laurier and Waterloo Working Group, Laurier Students Public Interest Research Group, Ellsberg, Independent Jewish Voices, Waterloo Region and Guelph Chapter, the Department of Indigenous Studies, Law and Social Justice at Laurier, the Department of Religion and Culture, the MA program in Religion, Culture, and Global Justice, the Faculty of Social Work, the Social Justice and Community Engagement MA program, the Department of Sociology, and the Women and Gender Studies program. This is a broad, diverse range of endorsers. Thank you for supporting tonight's event. We'll now begin the 4 panel presentations. I will introduce the speakers one at a time. Each will speak for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. If you would like to ask a question to a speaker or the panel as a whole, please enter your question in the chat box feature. It won't appear to the full webinar until after it's been posted, but the tech team will be compiling questions and sharing them with me, who will put them then on to presenters. And I do want to note that we hold a zero tolerance policy for comments and questions that are deemed discriminatory or hateful in nature. Any participant engaging in this form of commentary will be removed from the webinar. Thank you, tech team. Our first speaker is Dalia El Farra, whose research toward her Master's of Education focuses on workplace learning and social change, and who has substantial experience in building diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across different sectors. Dalia is Canadian-Palestinian, is a native Arabic and English speaker, volunteers with various community organizations, has 2 teenage children and 2 cats. Welcome, Dalia.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, actually. It's a privilege to be here tonight, and I thank you and everyone who made this happen. And no matter how much I've experienced and my people have experienced in the past 5 months especially, but also in the past 75 years, hearing it spelt out like that isn't easy, no matter how many times I hear it. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for your solidarity. I hope you can all see my screen. I usually start my introduction by introducing myself by saying that I'm Palestinian, as anyone who meets me personally or professionally can attest to. That's something they usually know within the first couple of minutes. I'm also an EDI person, which wasn't by chance. I had every lived experience lead me to very conscious decisions to focus my career on helping others on both a personal and systemic level. So one question I like to ask people is, what was the first big news story that you remember as a child? And the reason I'm putting this here is in my learning and unlearning with my Indigenous brothers and sisters and community members, storytelling comes across as a very important part of solidarity movements, of keeping equity struggles alive and in the fight for justice. So I do like to share a bit of my story. And so one question I do ask people is, what is the first big news story you remember as a child? You know, the kind of big news story that has everyone glued to the TV or social media or radio, if you want to age yourself. I love hearing people's responses. And being Palestinian, it shouldn't come as a surprise that mine is related to that. And it started on my 10th birthday, December 9th, 1987, the first Intifada, or the uprising. That experience and the family I was born into shaped me to the person I am today. I started the journey of storytelling, decolonization. I joined my community, I found my allies, and I continue to do so. As part of the storytelling, I do want to take a few minutes to share what the past few months have been like for me personally. I am from the Gaza Strip. I'm from the city of Khan Yunis, which unfortunately has become very familiar in the news. The ongoing genocide and the humanitarian tragedy is not just news headlines for me. It touches the very core of my existence. Seeing my family name and my children's family name being reported in the news as casualties. We've lost over 110 members from my side of the family and my children's side. My father was in Gaza when October 7th happened. Despite his mobility challenges, he had to relocate for safety multiple times within the Strip. Twice he was at the Rafah border when it was bombed. Thankfully, he managed to evacuate, but most of my family don't have the option or the privilege of a second citizenship to let them leave. And some of them have had to relocate over a dozen times because nowhere in Gaza is safe. And I generally don't like to share graphic images or videos, and I won't, but some of the things I've seen in the past few months cannot be unseen. I've watched a father cradle his newborn as they died because of the cold overnight in their tent. I've seen videos of one of my family's cemeteries where my grandfather and uncles were buried, raised and desecrated. I've watched a video of a doctor amputating his little girl's leg with no anesthesia. And I've watched dozens and dozens of videos of completely destroyed residential areas. And I have no physical locations in the Gaza Strip anymore that can tell the memory, can share my memories and tell our stories. I really understand what the word carnage means, physically, emotionally, and mentally. I won't share any of these, but I do want to take a minute to remind everyone that these aren't just numbers. These aren't just news headlines. These are people with lives and dreams for the future. This is Dalia El Farra, a graduate student who is only 2 months away from defending her doctoral thesis. She was killed while sheltering in Rafah, one of the designated safe zones in the south. This is Dalia El Farra. She loved dancing and playing dress up. She was killed in an airstrike that also killed her 2 brothers as they were sheltering in a UM school in Khan Yunis. This is Dalia El Farra with her father, Isam. They were both killed on October 29th in a bombing of their family home. All 14 members of Isam's family and his brother Jamal's family were killed that day, October 29th. It was also the day Tuqa's wedding was scheduled for. She was 22. This is Muhammad El Farra. He's a journalist, and this was the moment he heard that his wife and teenage children were killed. He has since been severely injured in a separate bombing. Why does it matter here in Canada? The past few months have really forced me to reflect on my position within Canada's societal fabric. I've grappled with feeling othered, like a second-class citizen that isn't considered worthy of dignity or basic human rights. And it isn't just me, it's a common sentiment among people I speak to from my diasporic Palestinian community. We feel disenfranchised and unsafe. Our whole sense of belonging in Canada has been shaken to its core, mostly because the systems that are meant to protect us, like political, media, education, civil services, and law enforcement, have made us feel less than human, vulnerable, and like our rights don't matter because of our background or skin color. We're facing unprecedented levels of anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobic hate motivated crimes and incidents. It's a widespread problem in Canadian society, which goes almost entirely unrecognized and unaddressed. It affects Palestinians from all backgrounds and religions, and non-Palestinians alike. APR is a distinct and unique form of racism which is perpetrated against Palestinians and supporters of Palestinian human rights. It silences, excludes, erases stereotypes, defames, dehumanizes, doxes Palestinians and their narratives. Some examples include justifying violence against Palestinians, defaming Palestinians and their allies, erasing human rights, excluding Palestinians or their perspective from any narratives, and failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous peoples with a collective identity. This is done by doxing, disciplining, and reprimanding Palestinians and supporters. And of course, by creating such fear of being reprimanded that people are often too afraid to speak out, and in some cases, even too afraid to identify as Palestinian. Now, there is a huge overlap between anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism does encompass most of the qualities of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, but with additional and unique features. Anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism, they're all connected, but still manifest differently. Arabs and Muslims can be anti-Palestinian, and they don't necessarily stand in solidarity with Palestinians. So it's not accurate to conflate Palestinians with all Arabs. And racialization, of course, is intersectional for Palestinians. Factors such as, are they wearing hijab, Islamic dress, keffiyeh, are they Black or Christian, means that all of their experiences are vast and diverse and nuanced, despite sharing anti-Palestinian racism. Some examples that are unique to anti-Palestinian racism, that is, for example, the narrative that Palestinians don't exist, or the notion that Palestinian identity is inherently controversial and complicated. The diaspora around the world having that strong desire to return to their parents' and grandparents' homeland, the compounding ongoing trauma of the violent occupation and genocide, and of course the ongoing, why don't Muslims in so-and-so country or Arabs in so-and-so country help? And some impacts of this is that APR compounds Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, which further isolates Palestinians and reinforces existing oppressions. The compounding hatred can lead to brutal violence against visible Palestinians and Muslims in general. For example, the 3 young men who were shot in Vermont, and the young 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was stabbed to death in the US as well, and the attack of Palestinian students at Columbia University. And you might say, well, that's the US, not Canada. I can tell you for a fact it's happening in Canada. I myself am a mother of a young man who had an attempted assault on him as he was protesting on his university campus here in the Greater Toronto area. And of course, framing Palestinian human rights as a religious conflict erases a huge part of the narrative, which is the settler colonial narrative, and creates deeper divides. Here in Canada, and I think we can probably share some of these, but these are some of the purveyors of anti-Palestinian racism based on examples given in this Canadian for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. The most prolific purveyor of anti-Palestinian racism was Honest Reporting Canada, but in terms of consistency and severity of racist anti-Palestinian views, one of the worst perpetrators was the J.ca. I also want you to take a moment and stop to think about why major news networks are so biased in their coverage. For example, the ICJ hearings that James referenced earlier. They barely even reported South Africa as part of the proceedings, but live streamed the Israeli defense at the ICJ. Or why, when it's reported in the media, it's Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, but not Yemenis, Palestinians, or Lebanese. This is all part of the dehumanization that is part of APR. While defamation related to claims of anti-Semitism ranked prominently, other forms of APR also stood out. The top 5 forms were: 1, erasing or excluding Palestinians and their narratives; slandering Palestinians and their allies as anti-Semitic; defaming Palestinians generally; and denying Palestinian indigeneity to Palestine; and denying the Nakba. Many pro-Israeli groups and media seem intent on preventing any discussion or engagement about Palestine or Palestinians. In this report that CJPME published a few weeks ago, it highlighted that the smear against Palestinians being anti-Semitic, it was the most prevalent form. And the anti-Semitism smear, when broken down into categories, four emerged as the most prevalent. One, criticizing Israel. Two, being anti-Israeli. Three, being anti-Zionist. And four, supporting BDS. These results, where criticism of Israel and Zionism figures so largely, clearly give credence to the argument that the IRA is the primary driver of APR. The IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Agency, I believe, which defines any criticism of Israeli, the definition of anti-Semitism according to IRA is defining any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic and defining any criticism of Zionism, Israel's founding ideology, as anti-Semitic. Now, I always want to take a moment to acknowledge anti-Semitism in this context. First and foremost, anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel are not anti-Semitic, and I see some of my colleagues will be speaking to that as well. But I do want to speak from personal experience. As Palestinians, we learned very early on how to differentiate the two, probably a lot better than most of our Western counterparts. We've always been conscious with our language and our thoughts in order not to demonize and alienate an entire Jewish population, many of whom are some of our strongest allies. Israeli propaganda wants people to believe that Zionism and Judaism are linked as a clear way to control the narrative and to shut down any attempts as resistance or counter-narrative. Does anti-Semitism exist? Of course it does, and it's on the rise, just like anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia and other types of xenophobia in the world. Is every act of decolonizing or criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. This is not a religious struggle. It is a settler colonial situation and a struggle over land sovereignty, human rights, and freedom. And this quote from an article by a former executive director of Hillel, Harvard, I think he was there for almost 18 years, sums it up well. Many of you may have heard some of these phrases over the past few months, maybe even earlier. And I do want to take a minute to acknowledge them. The word intifada, some of you may have heard it for the first month over the past few months, or some of you, like myself, have had it as part of their lexicon for decades. Zionist groups, biased media, and even many of our government officials will have you believe that the term is a call to incite violence. It is not. The term intifada is derived from the root word nafada or nafid. This literally means to shake something off, usually with fervor or passion. In Palestinian vocabulary, it means uprising or resistance. It means to shake off oppression and occupation. And intifada is a call for freedom from illegal occupation and an end to human rights violations. It is not a call to exterminate Jews. From the river to the sea is also another phrase that has a lot of attention, with claims of it being anti-Semitic, genocidal, and calling for violence against Jews. Again, this is a form of anti-Palestinian racism. Accusing Palestinians of having inherently violent or even genocidal intentions when they advocate for Palestinian liberation is anti-Palestinian. It is a form of racism. Or from the river to the sea means Palestinians do not want to dominate, subjugate, or oppress any other people. They want freedom of justice and justice for anyone, but that won't come at the cost, that will never come at the cost of subjugation and violence for others. Palestinians deserve equal rights on their ancestral lands, and Palestinian slogans exist to give Palestinians hope and to create shared experiences. They are not for others to define. Martyr and shaheed. I've had some questions about the term martyr or shaheed when referring to those killed by Israel. And one person even said to me that because they were martyred, they were seeking this kind of death and therefore they're not victims. Well, in a Western context, the term does have religious connotations. In the Palestinian context, it is a person wrongly killed because of the ongoing fight for liberation, regardless of their religious background. Now, this doesn't mean that it doesn't have any religious connotations. In Islam, in Islam, the religion where the majority of Palestinians follow, using the term shaheed describes the victim, and there is a belief that a shaheed gets the highest level of heaven. So that brings maybe some comfort to the families who've lost loved ones, and they want to believe that their loved ones haven't died in vain. But we Palestinians consider everyone killed a martyr, whether they were Muslim, Christian, atheist, or agnostic. We grieve innocent lives collectively. And I am a bit running out of time. I did want to speak a bit about EDI work in the current context and decolonizing, but I will wrap it up because I think I had 15 minutes and now I'm at 18. So I'm happy to be part of the question and answer after.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Extremely powerful and very informative presentation. And yeah, I think that some of what you were about to get into will be perfect for further discussion toward the end. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jasmine Zine. Dr. Zine is a professor of sociology and religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her recent book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, was named on the Hill Times list of best books of 2022. She is the author of a major report on the Canadian Islamophobia industry that examines the networks of hate and bigotry that purvey and monetize Islamophobia. I could go on and on about Dr. Zine, but I will only note that she is also the co-founder of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association. Welcome, Dr. Zine.
Thank you so much, James, and for your wonderful introduction, setting the stage for us, and to Dalia for her very powerful and also heartbreaking presentation. And we also share with you, Dalia, and with everyone, the grief and horror of the last several months. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay. So my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about and sort of unpacking the dimensions and manifestations of Islamophobia. We sort of envisioned this panel as a way of sort of demystifying concepts and ideas around these areas of anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, because so much out there is not understood. And I'm grateful to Dalia for unpacking a lot of what anti-Palestinian racism is about and how it is connected to Islamophobia. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into some of the dynamics of Islamophobia and look at that in a broader way, and particularly in how it's manifest within Canada. So I'm going to just start with what Islamophobia is and actually follow that up with what it isn't. So unlike the term may imply, Islamophobia is not really an irrational fear of hatred or Islam. And I say that because it's actually rooted in racial logics. There's a particular kind of logic behind it that is embedded in colonial and Orientalist histories. And Islamophobia refers to demonizing and dehumanizing Islam and Muslims, or anyone perceived as Muslim. We know that people who are not Muslim but are misperceived to be Muslim, for example, the first person shot in reprisal to the 9/11 attacks was a Sikh man in New York City because he was wearing a turban, and people associated him with Islam. So many others are not Muslim but may be subject to Islamophobia, and sadly to the violence that often accompanies it. And Islamophobia also relates to a racialization of religion. I don't have time to get into much to that concept, but that is part of what helps us understand how Islamophobia becomes manifest. And another manifestation of Islamophobia is a term that people often try and what people will use interchangeably, and that is anti-Muslim racism. And that is certainly a way that we can understand Islamophobia. It makes it more intelligible when we think about it as a form of racism. And we can also see anti-Muslim racism within a broader banner of Islamophobia in terms of how that discrimination is enacted, particularly upon Muslim bodies. But to understand Islamophobia and its complexity, it's important to consider that Islamophobic hate and bigotry are in fact translated into individual actions that are informed by negative ideologies and stereotypes, and then find expression in laws and policy. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more in my presentation as I go forward. But I also want to talk about what Islamophobia is not. And Islamophobia does not mean that you cannot be critical of Islam as you would any other religion. And it does not mean that you cannot criticize the policies and practices of Muslim majority states. Islamophobia is not tied to, criticism of any Muslim country is not tied to Islamophobia. And again, I'm talking about legitimate critiques and not when we get into demonization of Muslims, but critiques of policies and practices of Muslim majority countries are fair game. Islamophobia is also intersectional. And it's lived differently according to the specific social identities of Muslims. There's different gendered and racialized registers through which Islamophobia is experienced. Gendered Islamophobia is an intersection that is one that we see very often through specific forms of discrimination that are leveled against Muslim women. And those are rooted in colonial histories and negative Orientalist stereotypes. But Muslim men also face gendered Islamophobic stereotypes as well. There's also the intersection of anti-Arab racism and anti-Palestinian racism, which Dalia took us through, also anti-Brown racism and anti-Black racism. So there's many intersectionalities in relation to unpacking Islamophobia. I also want to point out that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. We can see how it is Islamophobia underpins so much of what is going on around the world, whether we're talking about Palestine, but also Myanmar and the Rohingya genocide there, China and the Uyghur genocide, India, Kashmir, and the suppression of Muslims in those countries, as well as within many and most, I would say, Western nations as well. So I want to make that clear that when we talk about Islamophobia, that it isn't just something that is happening within Canada, the US, or Western nations, but it is a global phenomenon. So more recently, in the last couple of years, I wrote a book called Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And that was a study that I did over many years, trying to understand the impact of 9/11 and the global war on terror, and how that affected Muslim youth in that millennial generation that has been dubbed the 9/11 generation, and how they navigated those conditions that they were, overnight seen as radicals and jihadists and terrorists, and how that affected them in their sense of identity, citizenship, belonging, and so on, and how they resisted that kind of categorization. In the present context, I started to think about what we are experiencing post 10/7 as a kind of deja vu of what happened after 9/11 in terms of the aftermath and backlash. But in fact, it is worse than what we experienced in the post 9/11 context. And I've, in other talks, tried to talk a bit about why I think that is. I'm just going to talk about a couple of those points now about how it's worse. And the current context that we're seeing now is actually worse because of the fact that Islamophobia has done its job over the last 2 decades and laid the groundwork that makes it easier to collectively label and punish Muslim populations, which is what we are seeing, of course, in Palestine. The global war on terror has been underpinned by racist ideologies, casting, what is 2 billion people around the world in a very singular and narrow trope of being violent, fanatical terrorists that threaten democracy, the stability of white nations, and Western civilization. So all of that has actually laid the groundwork for what we're seeing right now and made it a lot easier to demonize and vilify Muslims. We're also now living in what's been talked about as a post-truth world, where disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories, and Muslim scare stories are disseminated on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and through scores of blogs and websites that didn't exist back in 2001. And there are now coordinated subcultures that globally traffic in these false narratives. It's also worse now because we start to see a lot more of orchestrated censorship happening through various neo-McCarthyist campaigns and tactics. And I know my colleagues on the panel are going to be speaking about some of this, so I won't say more about that. I will flag one particular site that developed in the last decade or so called Canary Mission, which is set up to dox scholars and activists who are doing pro-Palestinian work, for example. So these kinds of things have escalated over the last couple of decades. And so finally, and now as I'm looking at what we are facing, and I'm, also thinking about the impact, the massive deaths of children in Palestine and the impact that that's having on a generation that's growing up now and bearing witness to this horror, this genocide that they are able to see in a way that you couldn't see even back in 2001 what was happening, because now we have social media and we can scroll through and every day see the images on multiple platforms of exactly what's happening. And so we need to think about now, I think, moving from the 9/11 generation to the 10/7 generation, and what will the impact be on the children and youth that are growing up now. And so I'm just going to leave you with that thought, and it's something I want to think more about as well as a follow-up to my book. One of the things that's very significant about Islamophobia, and I would say makes it quite distinct, is the fact that Islamophobia is organized, it's orchestrated, it's networked, and it's monetized. So as a system of oppression, it's quite distinct in that way. And organized Islamophobia occurs through the manifestation of what's been called an Islamophobia industry. There's been a lot of research on the Islamophobia industry, or the networks that have come together to foment Islamophobia through a variety of campaigns and actions, and through spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories and scare stories and so on. And a lot of research has been done in the United States. Books have been written, studies have been done. No one's looked at it in Canada. So in 2022, I came out with a report that took about 4 years to do, that looks at the Islamophobia industry in Canada and how that has become manifest here. And that industry is comprised of media outlets, what I call Islamophobia influencers, far-right white nationalist groups. In Canada, we have about 300 of them in different sizes and stripes. Think tanks and their designated security experts, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims, also part of that industry and network, and then the donors who fund these campaigns. So these individuals, groups, and institutions comprised a networked ecosystem that supports activities that demonize and marginalize Muslims. I mentioned that this industry is monetized, and a lot of that research has been done in the United States, where we've seen since about 2018, it's been the money going into various Islamophobia groups in the United States has been mapped since 2008 to 2019. And so the figures we see here is that from 2008 to 2013, the Council of American Islamic Relations identified 74 groups that either foster or fund Islamophobia. 33 during that period were inner-core groups that had access to over $204 million. And there were another set of about 41 groups that Islamophobia was not their core mandate, but they also were regularly involved in anti-Muslim advocacy. And so in 2013 alone, the inner core groups had access to about $35 million that circulated among them. Now in 2018, the Council of American Islamic Relations came out with a report called Hijacked by Hate rather. And they found that there was about $1.5 billion that circulated in the United States through 1,096 foundations, mainly philanthropic foundations and corporations, that was channeled into 39 Islamophobia network groups. through something called donor advised funds. So there did a very detailed report on the way that money traveled and how the funds that are available to anti-Muslim advocates are actually quite staggering. We don't have the same ability to track the money trail in Canada, but we do know that some of that money does filter here. So when I was looking at the Islamophobia industry in Canada, I was looking at some of the campaigns, some of the disinformation that they foment. This is just a brief example. And so the Islamophobia industry creates and circulates easily consumable and widely accepted content that purports to be factual and objective, but instead is based on often absurd and unsubstantiated claims. So, for example, in 2017, there was a flyer posted in city parks in British Columbia that asked residents to be, quote, courteous of their Muslim neighbors and keep their dogs on a leash and away from Muslims because dogs were considered to be filthy in Islam. And this poster falsely carried the logo of the Council of American Islamic Relations, or CARE, which, as I mentioned, is a US-based advocacy group. And a CARE spokesperson responded to this, saying that we see on occasion where people try to be a kind of agent provocateur and use these kinds of messages to promote hostility toward Islam and Muslims. Now, originally that story only had sort of limited local coverage, but 2 years later, the false and misleading post went viral and ignited social media comments from supporters of a network of anti-Muslim groups, from groups like Pegida, who said, I'll take any dog over these animals. The Canadian Combat Coalition said that Muslims should be put down instead of dogs. So these dehumanizing references of Muslims as, dogs or animals that were being maligned through this campaign. And then we saw a mix of American right-wing websites, Russian state media, and Canadian Facebook groups widely circulating that false story to claim that Muslims were, quote, trying to colonize Western nations. That this poster was an example of that plot for Muslims to be taking over. So these orchestrated controversies about Muslims perpetuate false narrative, are the modus operandi of Islamophobia networks. So I want to talk a bit about how Islamophobia becomes manifest. And I break it down in this framework to say that it is kind of like an iceberg, where what you see above the surface when we look at Islamophobia as a system of oppression are the kind of individual acts of Islamophobia that we can recognize through hate crimes and other things. What's below the water and what we don't often see are the ideologies that are propping up those and justifying those particular kinds of acts, and then are also mapped into systemic practices where Islamophobia becomes reproduced. So I'm just going to use that framework as a way to take you through some examples of those dimensions of Islamophobia. So the individual level, it would be anything from microaggressions, name-calling, vandalism, physical and sexual harassment, and violence also has taken place, hate crimes and terror attacks. All of these things have happened in Canada and as well as elsewhere. Some of these images relate to vandalism. Here, a swastika on a mosque in Edmonton. Here we see a pig's head wrapped in cellophane in blue and white ribbons in Quebec, and those are the colors of the Quebecois flag, with a card that reads Bon Appetit, and that pig's head was left at the door of a mosque in Quebec, where a year later a mass shooting happened. We also saw a spate of attacks against Black Muslim women in Edmonton. So again, that intersection of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia has come into effect. Those are some of the individual acts. And of course, the deadly consequences of Islamophobia in terms of mass shootings is something that we find that in Canada, Canada leads the G7 in terms of targeted killings of Muslims motivated by Islamophobia. So there was the Quebec City mosque shooting in 2017, where 6 Muslim men were shot dead after evening prayers. In 2021, 4 members of the Afzal family in London, Ontario, were intentionally mowed down by a truck and killed, and a 9-year-old boy survived. All of the victims of these attacks were racialized visible minorities, and the perpetrators were young white men. In the case of the Afzal family, recently a textbook terror charge was laid in that attack against the assailant. And that's a historic precedent because it's the first ruling in Canada to recognize terror on the grounds of white nationalism. Dalia made reference to these acts of violence as well that were more recent, just in the fall, but also very horrific. And these were south of the border, but I think still worth reflecting on. And that is the 3 university students of Palestinian descent who were childhood friends and were shot in a hate-motivated crime in Burlington, Vermont, on November 25th, 2023. They were speaking Arabic and wearing Palestinian keffiyehs, and one of the victims is now paralyzed from the waist down. A Palestinian American Muslim boy, Wadi El Farra, was killed after being stabbed 26 times on October 14th, 2023. His mother was also repeatedly stabbed. The family's white male landlord was arrested for the murder, and it was reported that as he was doing the killing, he shouted, "You Muslims must die." So these are some of the horrific consequences, deadly consequences of Islamophobia. And there's a lot of other hate crimes. I'm going to just go through some of those quickly. In 2020, a mosque caretaker was stabbed to death by a man who appeared to be associated with a satanic neo-Nazi cult, and that was in the Greater Toronto area. More recently, in 2023, in the Kitchener area, where Kitchener-Waterloo area, where Laurier is, a man allegedly pointed a gun at 2 Muslim women while in their car after leaving a mosque in Kitchener. In Montreal, a man entered a mosque and shattered the windows with a shovel. A man was yelling Islamophobic slurs and stopping cars outside the Islamic Society in Markham, near Toronto. And in the 2023 Senate report on Islamophobia that was released this fall, they document a lot of other actions. They did a study across Canada looking at Islamophobia. And some of those examples were an attacker brandishing an axe at a mosque. Women in Edmonton were thrown on the ground, threatened at knife point, having hot coffee poured on them, having eggs thrown at them on the street. And in Saskatoon, an elderly man was nearly run over by a pickup truck and later had a brick thrown through his window while another man was assaulted with a knife and had his beard cut off. More recently, since October 2023, anti-Muslim hate crimes spiked 1,600% across the GTA. Some examples across Canada include a taxi driver and a woman wearing a hijab were sprayed with a foreign substance. Worshippers at a Toronto mosque were attacked with a rock and bike chain. An Ottawa mosque was smeared with feces. And the Vaughan Islamic Center was evacuated due to a bomb threat. So these are just some of the kinds of hate crimes that are reported, but as we know, a lot of them don't get reported, and it's particularly when racialized minorities are targeted that they often have a reticence to reporting those crimes. So those are the tip of the iceberg. It's a lot, but it actually is the tip of the iceberg, because what we're not seeing when we look at that is what are some of the ideologies and stereotypes that are propping up those actions, rationalizing, justifying it for those who are perpetrating them. And this is where, in my study on the Islamophobia industry, I started mapping some of the conspiracy theories and tropes and Islamophobic narratives that are operating in Canada, but also globally. And so these are just some of the examples of what I call Islamophobia's playlist. And of course, among the greatest hits of that playlist is the idea that Muslims are terrorists, radicals, jihadists, and that's probably the most popular trope that associates Muslims with violence. And then that makes it possible, or it enables then all sorts of violence to be perpetrated against them in various conflicts, because there's a sense that they are, inherently, radicalized, terrorist, and violent, and so on. We also see some other notions here about Muslims as invaders within the West. So we can see over here, and that's Faith Goldie from Rebel Media, who's one of the Islamophobia influencers. We see this idea of a population jihad, that there is a kind of demographic replacement taking place in the West because Muslims are migrating here and will have more children and will overpopulate, and then that will lead to a white genocide, and that's often called a kind of population jihad. And if you see in this image here, the way a Muslim woman's womb, pregnant Muslim woman's womb, is characterized as a bomb. And so we see how women bear that reproductive danger. And if you look closely at this image, you'll see that the baby inside is wearing a Palestinian kufaya and has a gun. There's also other tropes using ideas of crusaders. There is crusader and Christian iconography that's used in a lot of white nationalist subcultures. This is Faith Goldie again and Lauren Southern, two Canadian Islamophobia influencers, bearing those symbols. This idea of taqiyya, that Muslims are deceptive and are really wolves in sheep's clothing and hiding an agenda. They're really here to take over the West through a civilizational jihad. And then this idea of the Trojan horse, where Muslims are, by stealth coming into Western nations and taking over. Just pointing out an example how some of these tropes come up when we look at some of the shooters that are involved in the terror attacks. This is Nathaniel Veltman, who was responsible for the killing of the Afzal family and was recently charged with terrorism. He said when he was arrested and went in great detail about how he wanted to give Muslims a taste of their own medicine and to seek revenge against Muslim grooming gangs, which is another conspiracy theory that Muslims are actually involved in sex trafficking. And that has been an inspiration for other white nationalists, and these ideas of white genocide and the Great Replacement we've seen in manifestos of other shooters, such as in New Zealand and also Anders Breivik in Norway. I'm just going to quickly show, this is a disturbing image here of how the Afzal family has been represented within white nationalist subcultures as dead invaders. And so you can see how that trope is actually quite alive and well in these subcultures. And also when someone kills a Muslim, they are considered a saint, so they become sainted. So that represents a lot of the far right echo chamber, but a lot of those ideas are actually part of the wider publics in Canada. And we can see through looking at the polls, public opinion polls in Canada, we can see how what those numbers tell us about how the Muslim presence in Canada is experienced by other Canadians. And it doesn't paint a very good picture. So for example, in 2017, a Radio Canada poll found that nearly 1 out of 4 Canadians, or 23%, would favor a ban on Muslim immigration to Canada. That was after Donald Trump was elected south of the border and instituted a Muslim ban in that country. And I think it's disturbing to see that 1/4 of Canadians would have been okay with a similar ban in Canada. And then in Quebec, support for this ban rose to 32%. The same poll also revealed that most respondents, 51% in Canada, 57% in Quebec, felt that the presence of Muslims in this country made them somewhat or very worried about security. So here you can see how some of those Islamophobic tropes, like the Muslim terrorist and the radical and jihadist, have actually animated particular kinds of racist fears and tensions and anxieties in society about the Muslim presence. And how then does that affect how people interact with Muslims in their community? Also, in relation to gendered Islamophobia, 2015 national poll found that 68% of Canadians disagreed with allowing Muslim women to wear the niqab or the face veil during citizenship ceremonies, and 72% agreed that the symbol of the niqab are symbols of oppression and rooted in a culture that is anti-woman. So again, those ideas of Islam being inherently misogynistic. And then in 2012, a survey on Canadian attitudes towards religion and multiculturalism found that 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims. So think about that. That's a majority. And 42% that believe that any discrimination against Muslims is mainly their own fault. So a victim blaming happening here. More recently, in 2023, Angus Reid poll found that Canadians are more likely to say that Islam is damaging to Canadian society than they were in 2022. More than 2 in 5, or 43% of Canadians, believe Islam to be a harmful presence to Canada. So the picture that we're getting, the numbers of the polls that we're seeing are not actually becoming more favorable when it comes to the Muslim presence in Canada. And so that is quite disturbing as well. So that's the ideology. And so those ideas now become, imported into policies and practices of state policies and practices. And so we have that systemic level of Islamophobia. And just quickly, these are a few things. We talk about racial profiling or flying while Muslim. There's also a no-fly list in Canada. We've seen even Muslim toddlers' names on the no-fly list. There's surveillance and security policies. There's been the surveillance of Muslim charities in Canada that are alleged to be fronts for Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, bans on religious attire that we've seen in Quebec, such as Law 21, and other kinds of discrimination in policy, as well as in healthcare and housing, employment, education, social services. So there's a wide range of systemic manifestations of Islamophobia. I want to just now, in closing, just talk about a couple of things that brings us back to still a systemic level of surveillance, but also around our campus communities. And so there's been a lot of surveillance of Muslim youth in Canadian universities, including Laurier. After 9/11, the RCMP started talking about the jihadization of Muslim youth as the greatest threat to global security. And over the last couple of decades, I found in my research, Muslim Student Association presidents and executive members were approached by CSIS, the RCMP, and counterterrorism units. Specific MSA groups have been under surveillance by security agencies. And that was true with Laurier as well. There was a recording device discovered in the prayer room at the Toronto Metropolitan University. There's been harassing of students more recently who are wearing kufayas. And there's been doxing and threats and intimidation of students, class action lawsuits, and I know my colleagues will speak about that as well. I just want to comment on a bit about the surveillance, though, in terms of the Laurier situation, because we've had members of the counterterrorism unit locally speak to members of the Muslim Student Association over the years. I remember when my son was elected president at Laurier's Muslim Student Association, and the very next day got a call from CSIS on his cell phone. So that surveillance is there, and that surveillance becomes internalized by Muslim youth as well, who then have to live with that sense of being watched and surveilled, and always are careful not to make sure that they're not being perceived as a threat by others. So, they don't want to play paintball up north because they don't want to be seen as a terrorist cell, or they don't want to play violent video games in public because people might think they're plotting a violent attack, right? So this is some of the consequences in terms of how that gets internalized. And finally, these are some examples of Islamophobic incidents on campuses. And this focuses on one university, and that's Western, because there was a study done on that, or there was a documenting by the Muslim Student Association that was reported in a CBC media report last year. And there were incidents, for example, such as Muslim female students being accosted by strangers, and in some cases told that they should be raped and killed. Muslim students who were called terrorists on campus, female students physically assaulted and pushed after they were wearing hijab and kufaya, student who had their car tires slashed on campus because they had a Palestinian flag on the mirror, students who've been spat on. And I heard recently that this was an incident also that happened at Laurier because a student was wearing kufaya. I also remember years ago when two Muslim students were wearing kufayas and had those ripped off their heads, and that happened at Laurier as well. In classrooms, students have sat in classes with lecture material, including pictures of Palestinian babies wearing props, while a professor discussed what makes a terrorist a terrorist. And so, again, a female student who was told that all Muslims must die. I remember coming to Laurier and seeing a statement like that in graffiti when I arrived here. So we are also experiencing on all of our campuses for a long time now, anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia. Now we're seeing a lot more uptick in anti-Palestinian racism. And so this is something that becomes a collective responsibility to be able to learn more about, and then to be able to work in solidarity to resist and challenge, not just on our campuses, but globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Our third speaker is Dr. Cheryl Nestle. Dr. Nestle taught sociology and equity studies at Boise at the University of Toronto from 2000 to 2012. She's published extensively on race and racism in the health professions and recently completed a groundbreaking research project called Unveiling the Chilly Climate, the Suppression of Speech on Palestine in Canada. She serves on the steering committees of the Jewish Faculty Network and the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine. She is an affiliated scholar at New College, University of Toronto. Welcome, Dr. Nestle.
Thank you, James. And I really have to thank my co-panelists, because this has been such a serious and deep exploration of these issues. And I am really very grateful to be in your company. And thank you to the organizers. I know this has not been the easiest event to organize. So what I want to address here today is the stark divide in the Jewish community over the question of support for Israel. So contentious debates about what constitutes contemporary anti-Semitism have been central to this divide, and I will be focusing on that. If we believe, and I do, that one of the fundamental principles of anti-racism is to reject any impulse to essentialize an identifiable group as sharing characteristics, appearances, behaviors, or ideologies that are understood to be inherent, even biologically innate, to that group, then we need to interrupt the notion, despite the claims of the institutional Jewish groups, that Jews are united in their political opinions and aspirations. To put it bluntly, Jews are wildly diverse in their origins, beliefs, behaviors, physical appearances, and political loyalties, and arguments that Jews uniformly believe in any one political ideology can be easily debunked by even the most cursory look at Jewish history. Zionism, the 20th century Jewish political creed claiming that only a sovereign Jewish state in historic Palestine would be able to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, has been debated and disputed by Jews for more than a century. Zionism, nonetheless, has become a central tenet in contemporary Jewish life. As Jewish studies scholar Shaul Magid notes, the dogma of compulsory Zionism, those are my words, has rendered, quote, non or anti-Zionism an unspoken heresy, unquote, within mainstream Jewish organizations and communities. So the Jewish debate about Zionism has intensified significantly in the current moment. Anti-Zionist Jews such as myself, who oppose the idea of a state which privileges the rights of Jews over non-Jews, find ourselves clamoring to be heard as Israeli bombs decimate Gaza. The notion of a unified community voice crumbles as more and more Jews, especially young Jews, are challenging the hegemony of the Zionist idea. As Adolf Reed Jr. writes, the idea of community is a mystification, and an anti-democratic one at that. All social units are comprised of discrete individuals whose perspectives and interests and alliances differ, and every unit's members are bound together through a combination of negotiation and coercion. The less attention is paid to cultivating and protecting the sphere of negotiation, the more the balance shifts to coercion. Hegemonic projects operate principally at the level of institutions and invariably entail the coercion, exclusion, delegitimization, or physical elimination of organized alternatives. So it is this turn to coercion, exclusion, and delegitimization aimed at Jews who dissent from this dogma that I find disturbing, divisive, and fundamentally antithetical to a prophetic tradition of justice that is foundational to Jewish life. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and tell you something about myself. I am not a detached outsider to this debate, and neither is anyone else on this panel, I might point out. Unfortunately, Jews who share my beliefs are sometimes labeled with epithets such as capo, which was a term assigned to Jews who assisted the Nazis during the Holocaust, or un-Jews, who are seen to disingenuously leverage Jewish identity in order to criticize the Jewish state. And these are some of the things I was accused of in the context of this event tonight. So being Jewish has always been at the center of my life. 48 years ago, I married into a Holocaust survivor family, and my late mother-in-law's painting of her neighbors being shot and thrown into a deep pit hangs in my office. In 1973, I moved to Israel, where I lived for the next 15 years. My 3 children were born there, and my husband served in the army as a medic. We left in 1988 because we believed that Israeli Jews, despite the widespread uprising of occupied Palestinians during the First Intifada, were willing to continue to be the masters of millions of Palestinians. I speak fluent Hebrew, celebrate Jewish holidays, bake challah for Shabbat every week, and have belonged to a synagogue for 35 years. But despite all of this, my disloyalty to Zionism and criticism of the Jewish state have made me a pariah in my own community and the target of harassment, including in relation to my participation in this webinar. To my great regret, Jewish communal life in Canada is dominated by organizations which claim to speak for all Jews, despite any semblance of a communal democratic process in determining their policies or actions. Indeed, while in the past, Jewish organizations benefited from the counsel of scholars, rabbis, and other learned members of the community, they are now dominated by a self-selected donor class. Whereas once small donors were valued and nurtured, now multi-million-dollar donor-directed funds court the engagement of the richest and most politically influential community members. Ideological checkpoints now determine who is and who is not a legitimate Jew. While this is never reflected in the official communications of institutional Jewish organizations, several recent opinion polls have demonstrated that there is indeed a diversity of opinion among Canadian Jews when it comes to Israel. A poll published last June by liberal Zionist organizations JSpace and the New Israel Fund reported that 59% of Canadian Jews believe that Israel is going in the wrong direction. 58% want the Canadian government to refuse to meet with racist extremist members of the Israeli government, and half of those with an opinion on the matter felt that legacy Jewish organizations did not represent them when it came to criticizing Israel. How that has changed after October 7th is a question yet to be answered, and we're actually planning to do a new poll very soon. What we do know is that Jews are openly demonstrating against this war in unprecedented numbers. In the US, 1,000 Jews occupied Grand Central Station, and hundreds blocked bridges throughout the United States to protest the war. Every demonstration here in Canada has featured a large Jewish contingent. Anti-Zionist Jewish organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace in the US and Independent Jewish Voices here in Canada, as well as other groups around the world condemning Israel's war in Gaza, have welcomed thousands of new members. However, those who believe that a state, However, those who believe that a state of Jews and for Jews, which is the foundation of political Zionism, is inherently colonial, undemocratic, racist, and illiberal, are accused of denying Jews the same rights accorded to other national groups. This is the basis of the accusations of a new quote-unquote new anti-Semitism, which sees Israel as, quote, the Jew among nations, in the words of Canada's former anti-Semitism czar, Irwin Cotler. The anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism argument means that individuals or institutions can be accused of anti-Semitism for holding opinions that can range from criticism of the policies of the Israeli government to denying that Israel has the right to exist as an exclusively Jewish state, even if these opinions in no way reference beliefs or expressions that have been traditionally regarded as constituting an anti-Semitic worldview. Indeed, calls for a ceasefire uttered by millions around the world in response to the horrific slaughter of Gazans is being labeled as anti-Semitic because it is seen as impeding Israel's right to defend itself. The slaughter of 30,000 people, 12,000 of whom were children, is seen as a small price to pay for Israeli security and entirely justifiable as retribution for the brutal attack of October 7th. The lives of Palestinians are, in philosopher Judith Butler's words, ungrievable and do not merit the same kind of mourning as do the lives of Jewish Israelis. These are the sentiments that are fragmenting Jewish communities and those who study them worldwide. A distinct ideological divide exists between those Jews who believe that the lesson taught by the Holocaust is never again will Jews endure a Holocaust, and those who believe that never again is a universal rallying cry against genocide. What the concept of a new anti-Semitism has enabled is the use of allegations of Jew hatred as a weapon to silence criticism of Israel and discredit and impede the struggle for Palestinian human rights. Accusations of anti-Semitism always carry with them associations with the Holocaust and the Nazis' genocidal extermination of most of Europe's Jews. This form of defamation has been referred to as the nuclear option of political rhetoric, a bludgeon that automatically renders someone outside the realm of purported modern Western values of tolerance and civility. It is a powerful rhetoric that portrays those accused as morally defective and fits neatly into our post-9/11 world of deep Islamophobia, anti-Arabism, and anti-Palestinian racism. Israel's war in Gaza has given new life to these ideologies. Attempts to brand pro-Palestine demonstrators as anti-Semitic have been ubiquitous. Demonstrators are consistently labeled as pro-Hamas, pro-hate, Jew-hating, or as terrorist sympathizers. The imagined spectacle of rampaging mobs permeates these social media posts and the op-eds of Jewish communal spokespeople and opportunistic politicians alike. Demonstrators are painted with the same racist brush as our Palestinians, who have consistently been portrayed as barbaric and uncivilized or somehow less than human. Allegations of anti-Semitism play in the rhetoric and actions of those Jewish groups that unconditionally support Israel and who are attempting to discredit and even criminalize those who are showing up in their tens of thousands to oppose Israel's war on Gaza. This strategy is central to Israel's public diplomacy gambit, better known as Hasbara. Journalist Joshua Leifer explains, the Israeli government long ago adjusted its public relations strategy so that today the Israeli Hasbara apparatus's most active front is the attempted redefinition of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, with the goal of rendering any opposition to the occupation or Zionism, or even simply Israeli policies themselves, beyond the pale of mainstream acceptability. Several pro-Israel organizations worldwide collect and disseminate reports accounting for anti-Semitic incidents and levels of anti-Semitism. There exists a growing dispute within the international Jewish community over how accurately these reports identify the sources of contemporary anti-Semitism, and consequently whether claims of burgeoning anti-Semitism, coming largely from legacy Jewish organizations, are entirely credible. When political activity and expressions of anti-Israel or pro-Palestine sentiment are believed to constitute anti-Semitism, the potential for exaggerating the threat of anti-Semitism is great. When Jewish communal institutions cite pro-Palestine speech and activism as a major source of anti-Semitism, the implication is that left-wing ideology and political action constitute the major threat to Jewish safety. However, studies in the US and Europe demonstrate conclusively that anti-Semitic sentiment is far more prevalent on the political right than on the political left. The fatal flaw in this line of reasoning is that emphasis on anti-Israelism as anti-Semitism threatens to divert attention away from the largest documented threat to Jewish safety, the white supremacist right. This is in no way to deny that we are experiencing a surge in anti-Semitism worldwide. I'm particularly disturbed by the idea purveyed by both pro-Israel groups and anti-Semites that being Jewish equates with supporting Zionism and that diaspora Jews naturally back the current genocidal onslaught on Palestinians in Gaza. This notion threatens to assign collective guilt to all Jews for Israel's behavior. Attacks on individual Jews or Jewish buildings with no justification other than that they are Jewish is completely intolerable and must stop. I believe that we must resist pressure to equate strong, empirically based criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. For the last 5 years, as a member of Independent Jewish Voices, I have helped conduct dozens of anti-Semitism trainings to a wide variety of groups in Canada, based on foundational anti-racist principles and progressive Jewish scholarship. And I want to outline some of those principles here. So the first one is that the intensification of anti-Semitism is endemic to the rise of racism. So the recent rise of anti-Semitic incidents cannot be separated from the escalation of racism and xenophobia in general throughout the West and elsewhere. Fighting and educating against anti-Semitism must be part of a larger struggle against all group hatred and discrimination. Anti-Semitism is unique, but not exceptional. Like other forms of racism, anti-Semitism has unique characteristics, but it is not an exceptional form of hatred. Treating anti-Semitism as exceptional undermines the project of building solidarity with other anti-racist struggles, which is a key strategy for keeping all of us safe. Anti-Semitism is contextually specific. So we challenge the idea that anti-Semitism is eternal and inevitable. Certain anti-Semitic tropes echo across centuries, but their meanings shift in relation to specific contexts. Anti-Semitism emerges in different historical periods for different reasons. Any analysis of anti-Semitism must take the historical, political, cultural, geographic, and intellectual context into consideration. Next, the Jewish experience is diverse. The Jewish experience should be understood in all its diversity and richness, and not just as an inventory of suffering. The European Jewish experience differs substantially from that of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We recognize the imperative to represent the geopolitical realities of Jews and their experiences of anti-Semitism from a variety of locations. Next, histories of genocide both in Europe and the global South are intertwined. The historic persecution of Jews, including its genocidal expression in the Holocaust, should be viewed together with histories of enslavement, colonial exploitation, and the numerous other genocides committed by the West against racialized populations. This view sees these crimes not as a deviation from, but as a central and ongoing feature of Western geopolitical domination. This approach offers an opportunity to build a politics of mutual recognition, of suffering which disavows exceptionalism and insists the genocidal crimes of colonialism and neocolonialism be recognized alongside the Holocaust as paradigmatic examples of evil. Moreover, in an era of global migration, where some learners are likely to be refugees or descendants of refugees from formerly colonized territories and other political conflict zones, there is an urgent need to validate their experiences and to make connections that build mutual understanding and solidarity. And finally, anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitic. So criticism of Zionism and/or the state of Israel, which is rooted in an opposition to ethno-nationalism and based on a belief in a solution to the conflict that accords full equality to all those residing in Israel-Palestine, should not be considered anti-Semitic. However, critiques which draw on recognizable anti-Semitic notions, such as Jews control the media, the government, etc., must be recognized as harmful and should be distinguished from legitimate criticism of a country that has been described by several respected human rights organizations as constituting an apartheid regime. It concerns me that in the context of the war on Gaza, when tens of thousands of Canadians, including hundreds of Jews, are marching in the streets every week, clamoring for a ceasefire, that the institutional Jewish community, legacy organizations like B'nai B'rith Canada, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, and the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs call for the continuation of this devastating war and even condemn the Liberal government for finally taking the moral position of endorsing a ceasefire and reinstating funding to UNRWA. I can't help but believe that the nearly 50% of Canadians who support a ceasefire and who do not believe that support for Palestinians equates with support for Hamas are particularly sympathetic to the pronouncements of those who claim to represent the Jewish community. I'll conclude by saying that when a politics of dispossession and racism is pursued in the name of protecting and defending the Jewish people, dissident Jews loudly proclaim that we are not represented by such politics. Rather, we stand with those who are murdered, imprisoned, and made homeless and stateless by these policies. This was done to us. Why are we doing it or lending our support to those Jews who are doing it to others? We assert that it must be principles and not blood that determine where we stand. Despite what the mainstream Jewish world would have us believe, a moral, creative, and authentic Jewish life is not antithetical to support for Palestine and opposition to a Jewish ethnocracy in historic Palestine. Rather, solidarity with the Palestine liberation struggle is fundamental to a livable Jewish future based on principles of justice, righteousness, and solidarity. The dilemma for Jews in this moment is whether to choose fidelity to or betrayal of what appears to be the Jewish communal consensus. The biblical admonition to not hate your co-religionist in your heart requires speaking out rather than maintaining silence about the transgressions of our communities. For some members of my community, speaking out publicly against Israel's dispossession of and violence against the Palestinian people constitutes a betrayal. However, fidelity to our community in regards to Israel can constitute betrayal of another sort, the betrayal of the moral and spiritual precepts that are central to Judaism. These fundamental precepts, which are connected to both Jewish history and religious tradition, teach us that we Jews are obligated to engage with the struggles for liberation of others. If we deny or refuse this imperative, and when others become our victims, argues Jewish theologian Mark Ellis, the brokenness of our past is betrayed and our political empowerment is made suspect. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nestel. Extremely rich presentation. Our fourth and final presenter tonight is Dr. Alejandro Paz. Dr. Paz is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and he has published widely about the politics of migration, language, and citizenship in Israel-Palestine, as well as settlement in occupied East Jerusalem. He co-chairs the Hearing Palestine initiative at the U of T and is on the steering committee of the Jewish Faculty Network. Welcome, Dr. Paz. Start again, Alejandro. I can't hear you right now.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, James, and to all my co-panelists for your rich discussions, and especially at this vital time for coming together. And I especially want to reach out to Dalia and to all of those who have lost family and loved ones during these horrible times. May their memory be a blessing and a revolution, and we will always keep their memories living. And I say this also because I know there's a lot of people who felt that they could criticize this panel. I say this also as someone who has a lot of family and loved ones in Israeli cities and towns, including extended family that were taken hostage on October 7th, one of whom is still hostage. I will never forget those people who were killed on October 7th, and I mourn their loss deeply. I'm a scholar of Israeli state and society for the most part. In the last few years, however, as part of my work with Hearing Palestine, I've become more familiar with the literature of Palestine studies, and I've strengthened my ties to scholars of Palestine studies and scholars working in Palestine. So just as a bit of background about me, I want to do two things today. I want to discuss briefly the approach that we, as part of the Jewish Faculty Network and as part of networks more broadly that have been in conversation prior to October, but even more intensely since October, what is the approach we've been developing to think about anti-Semitism? I'll keep mine brief because Cheryl, towards the end of her beautiful presentation, really spoke to this. And then I want to discuss from a historical perspective where the term new anti-Semitism emerges, and how it is related to the settler colonial project that continues to unfold under the state of Israel. So I don't have time to give that history in detail, but I do want to kind of outline it, sketch it very quickly for everyone and show these kinds of relationships. And I want to start the first part with how this panel has been put together. On this panel, we have speakers with expertise to address a range of interconnected racisms and bigotry, not just one. And that is a significant achievement already. To my mind, this intellectual work is crucial, now maybe more than ever, because it suggests an approach to anti-Semitism that we really need. This intellectual work is needed now more than ever because together we can help create the world where Palestinians and Israelis can live together in peace, freedom, and equality. Now, I'm here to focus on anti-Semitism, but it bears repeating about any form of racism and bigotry, and all the three previous speakers spoke to this in some way. It is important to hold in view, both on the one hand, the specific histories and effects where a particular form of racism and bigotry reared its head, as well as on the other hand, understand that that racism exists in a broader constellation of prejudice and bigotry. And therefore, we want to acknowledge the specific history of anti-Semitism and its effect on Jewish communities, as well as acknowledge that that history is tied to other histories which produce racisms of other kinds. And in this vein, second part of my talk especially will focus on, we want to keep in mind the history of European and North American colonialism, especially of the late 19th and early 20th century, and the continuing institutions of that colonialism that are present today. And the reason we want to keep that in mind is that too often the most vocal advocates or supporters of the State of Israel, here in Canada as well as elsewhere in the world, seek to address anti-Semitism as if it is a unique or preeminent form of racism and bigotry. They do not want to place it alongside other forms of racism and bigotry like we have done on this panel. They want us to treat it separately. If they did put in a more general approach to combat all forms of racism and bigotry, they would probably be forced to contend with their own Islamophobia and anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism, and certainly they would be forced to contend with a long history of such racism in the actions and statements of Israeli leaders. I'm going to skip some of this because I think Cheryl covered it. So now from the second part, for my contribution to our discussion, I'm going to focus on the emergence of the concept, the new anti-Semitism, and tie it to the settler colonial project of the Israeli state. And here I'm relying on the one hand, especially on the work of Amy Kaplan, John Mearsheimer, and Stephen Walt, and Antti Lerman about the history of the concept of the new anti-Semitism, and on the other hand, on a very broad reading and long-term reading on the history of Palestine-Israel. I think it is important to understand how this concept emerged in order to determine how to fight real anti-Semitism of the kind that Cheryl mentioned, that emerges especially from right-wing white nationalism, and how to avoid falsely accusing as anti-Semitic legitimate public criticism and peaceful protest movements. I also think such a discussion is important to recognize how the use of the concept, the new anti-Semitism, by its proponents can propagate other forms of racism and bigotry, and Dalia spoke to this. The idea of the new anti-Semitism was codified, that is, given its strongest official definition, through the International Holocaust Remembrance Association working definition that Cheryl mentioned a little bit earlier, and as did Dalia. So as a kind of quick reminder, essentially the concept of the new anti-Semitism is that the State of Israel is the quote-unquote collective Jew in international arenas, and no one should call into question its present form as a state, which upholds the rights of Jewish residents at the expense of Palestinians. Any such questioning or criticism of the way the institutions and politics of the Israeli state function to maintain the rights of Jewish people as superior is considered anti-Semitic by this concept of the new anti-Semitism. That is, the effort by civil rights activists and leaders for generations to criticize, for example, second-class citizenship in Canada or the US, or to criticize the racial institutions of apartheid South Africa. If they make a similar criticism of the State of Israel, proponents would count these kinds of criticisms as anti-Semitic. Under the rubric of the new anti-Semitism, are legitimate political criticisms of the Israeli state. This is why it is necessary to oppose the use of the term anti-Semitism when it's used to prevent legitimate and free political debate. You may not agree with the use of, for example, boycott or sanctions on Israeli institutions as a form of protest, and I may argue with you about why I think it is necessary, but you cannot call me an anti-Semite because I disagree with your political position. And here I just want to remind everyone of the Jewish Faculty Network letter, which has been signed by over 210 Jewish faculty from across Canadian colleges and universities, which opposes this conflation of criticism of the State of Israel with anti-Semitism, and especially says that although not everyone agrees with, for example, BDS, it is not anti-Semitic to support BDS. Okay. You won't generally find the proponents of the IHRA or the more general term, the new anti-Semitism, using that term. They will just say, that's anti-Semitic, or use a similar expression. Often the terminology that proponents of the new anti-Semitism use is that, quote, Israel is being held to a higher standard, or, quote, Israel is being singled out or delegitimized, or that the expression or person betrays a, quote, anti-Israel animus. But there is a second aspect to the concept, which, as I've thought about it more and more and been active in the JFN for a longer time, I realize is actually the more important part. And that is the institutional use of the concept. The organized proponents of the concept of the new anti-Semitism, what Mearsheimer and Walt call the Israel lobby, want to be the official arbiters of what counts as anti-Semitism under this concept. They don't want to acknowledge that there is a debate among Jewish experts and leaders about the concept. They just want you and all of us to accept their authority. They thus want to make themselves judges of anti-Semitism and to institutionalize this concept, the new anti-Semitism, in a quasi-legal manner. So you can't judge for yourself if you're an EDI officer or the president of a university or the principal of a school or what have you, or a politician, whether something is anti-Semitic or not. They, that is the Israel lobby groups, like those that Cheryl named, they become the arbiters. They become the ones who decide. Importantly, many of the institutional actors who seek to arbiter what kind of behavior falls under this expanded concept of anti-Semitism actually propagate Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. And we've seen countless examples, especially in the last 5 months. So back to our framework with which we want to develop an approach to anti-Semitism that helps us combat all kinds of racism and bigotry. Any actor who may promulgate one kind of racism while speaking about another isn't doing enough to fight racism in general, and in fact, doesn't make us any safer. Now, I'd like to explain the relation of the concept of a new anti-Semitism to the history of the State of Israel. I can't go through this in a lot of detail, but it isn't possible to understand the legitimation of the State of Israel without thinking through a history of racisms and racial hierarchies that are implemented through colonial regimes. Historically, like the Canadian state, the State of Israel is a settler colonial endeavor that emerged out of the British colonial state, and it maintains several aspects of that colonial apparatus. This is not exceptional. We are not singling out the State of Israel when we say that. This is actually quite prevalent in Canada, in the US, and in fact, many post-colonial states have integrated some of the colonial institutions into their system of rule and continue to use them. In other words, we have not fully decolonized, and full decolonization is a difficult process to achieve, and yet we really need to keep working towards it. Now, there's a long, complex history of violent and virulent anti-Semitism that led some Jewish leaders to argue that there is only one answer to the Jewish question of Europe. Jews need to establish a homeland outside of Europe. This didn't become possible, really, until the British conquest in 1917 of Palestine and the subsequent establishment of the British colonial mandate over Palestine. It was only then that the Zionist organizations could concentrate their energies on settling Jewish Europeans in Palestine. And this is kind of a tragedy of history, because it was colonial officials, especially racist British officials like Lord Balfour, who was a complete anti-Semite, who favored European Jews in the governing of the British mandate over Palestine over the indigenous Palestinian Arabs. So this kind of colonial hierarchy became part of the institutions of the Israeli state and became part of governing everything from infrastructure to benefits to access to wealth and so on. And it was during this period where the building of Zionist settlement and institutions of rule expanded, and then especially during the 1948 war, which became the basis of the present state of Israel. And during the 1948 war, with the expulsion and exile of upwards of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs. Now, I'd like to turn to the context for the initial appearance of the claim of, quote, new anti-Semitism, because it occurred kind of around the 1967 war. The 1967 war is when the Israeli state conquered new lands from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and which also led to more expulsions and exiles. Now, some of those lands were subsequently returned in peace agreements, in a peace agreement with Egypt. It was at that time that the Israeli government immediately moved its system of military rule, which it had over Palestinians who were citizens of the state of Israel, and moved it to from the 1948 territories to the 1967 territories. It had been preparing for this. Now, at the same time that this occurred, we remember the 1960s were an intense period of decolonization and the rise of the new left, and the expansion of new civil rights movements and criticisms of US imperial actions, like in Vietnam. It was during this period that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, became a separate entity that came to represent Palestinian people wherever they may be. And we kind of have to keep this context in mind. And something else was happening in the 1960s, which Amy Kaplan, I mentioned before, has described for the US, but I suspect it's generalizable for many North Atlantic countries, including Canada. Israel became a hero in dominant US public opinion. This happened during a time when there were huge debates about US imperialism during the Vietnam War. Speaking about the Israeli victory in 1967, Kaplan writes, "The dramatic action of Israeli soldiers averting apocalypse had a cathartic effect," that is, a cathartic effect on American public opinion. In Israel's swift victory over Soviet allies, Americans could vicariously experience both the dread of vulnerability and the thrill of invincibility, the irrefutable victory that was eluding them in Vietnam. So it gives you a little bit of a taste. Of course, it's a much more complex argument, but a little bit of a taste of that time period. And it's really important to remember that after the 1967 war, there was a rising criticism of the state of Israel for its unwillingness to allow Palestinian refugees to return, and its unwillingness to give back the new lands which it had just conquered. So it's in that context that the term new anti-Semitism, or sometimes functional anti-Semitism, emerged and was promulgated. As Anthony Lerman shows, post-67 war, after the 1967 war, and with the support for the so-called Zionism as Racism UN resolution, this led to the first round of defining and discussing criticisms of the Israeli state as anti-Semitic. That is, the concept of the new anti-Semitism arose as a response to criticisms of a new phase in the Israeli settler colonial project, to expand its settlement in particular to the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, let's not forget, although also to Gaza and other conquered territories. For instance, an early expression by Israel's then foreign minister, Abba Eban, who stated in 1973 at a conference, which was later republished, "Recently, we have witnessed the rise of the new left, which identifies Israel with the establishment, with acquisition, with smug satisfaction, with, in fact, all the basic enemies. Let there be no mistake. The new left is the author and the progenitor of the new anti-Semitism." Okay, so what does he mean by that? "One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not a distinction at all," right? And we've heard this in the last few days, the same wording. Anti-Semitism is merely the new anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism. The old classic anti-Semitism declared that equal rights belong to all individuals within the society except the Jews. The new anti-Semitism says that the right to establish and maintain an independent national sovereign state is the prerogative of all nations, so long as they happen not to be Jewish. End of quote. Okay. Now, Anthony Lerman argues that the final codification of this concept comes much later, with events after the 9/11 and the Second Intifada, and then it's finally codified with that extremely problematic International Holocaust Remembrance Association working definition. And again, I refer you to the letter from the Jewish Faculty Network, which outlines all the problems with the definition. Okay, where do we see this concept used today? BDS and other Palestinian solidarity movements, or the NGO reports that discuss how the state of Israel has committed crimes of apartheid and persecution and the like. The state of Israel, along with its prominent organized allies abroad, have instrumentalized the charge of anti-Semitism in order to silence these criticisms and these protest activities. And so evidence-based discussion of the ongoing settler colonial enterprise is called anti-Semitic. It is not. It is legitimate criticism central to any decolonization process. We're doing important work. It is hard work, but we need to be able to speak and argue about legitimate political positions without being intimidated by the threat of being called anti-Semitic. I'd like to end by speaking to our critics, who I know are listening. Listening, but not yet ready to really hear us. Cheryl and I both grew up fearful, just like you, fearful for the history of dehumanization and violence, which our family suffered for being Jewish, especially in Europe. We feel that fear in our very bones. Where we differ from you today is in the realization that the state of Israel does not guarantee our humanity as Jewish people in this world. Let me say that again. The state of Israel does not guarantee our humanity as Jewish people in this world. It cannot guarantee Jewish humanity when it is based on the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. To understand this, we have to understand what I mentioned earlier, that part of the tragedy of racism and European colonial hierarchies, which is of course a subject too large to get into here, but part of that tragedy of 20th century Jewish history, especially as it played out in the first half in Europe, is a history that led so many Jewish communities, and especially their leaders, to a wrong-headed conclusion. That the only way to guarantee Jewish humanity, the only way to protect Jewish people from dehumanization and virulent anti-Semitic violence was, they thought, to become like other Europeans. That is, to become racist settlers and colonizers. We can understand how they came to this conclusion, even as we can understand that it was a tragic and misguided one which has only led to a history of more racist violence. There was no plan. This did not happen through a conspiracy, nor anyone's intention. It was not inevitable. There were other paths that could have been taken. Many of those other paths were ended by the Holocaust. It was a contingency of history. It was just the way history tragically played out at that moment in time, especially with the strength of European colonialism to shape the world's political economy. But we can take another path. We can refuse. We can refuse to participate in the racism of European colonialism, which continues today, including in the institutions of the US and Canadian states. We can refuse to accept the artifice of Jewish liberation when others are not liberated in the process. We can refuse to accept that a state has solved the Jewish question when the state's institutions propagate racism against others. We can refuse to view racism against Jewish people as more pernicious than racism of any other kind and treat it as unique. When we take our fears, and I know that these fears are real, I feel them, and when we take them and refuse to have them prop up the racisms of European colonialism, then we discover that Jewish liberation is not separate from Palestinian liberation, and that our struggle for tikkun olam is part of the same struggle as that of the Palestinians and of many other people around the world who face daily dehumanization, oppression, and dispossession. And that only in joining in that struggle can we actually guarantee Jewish humanity. Purim is coming, Purim. It is high time to realize that Haman is not the Jewish people who refuse to ignore how the state of Israel has emerged from a European colonial project, but rather Haman is that European colonial racism which dehumanized our families and led them to slaughter. It is time to realize that in Palestinian liberation, we will also find our own. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Paz. The historical development of the concept of the new anti-Semitism and rooting it in the history of global decolonial struggles is extremely powerful. And I am moved and appreciative of your words. This is my proposal. We are near the end of our allotted time. We have had excellent questions coming in from the audience. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. My proposal is this. I've identified 2 questions. How about I ask those 2 questions and then we go through each panelist, and I'm sorry to tell you that you're only going to have about 2 minutes or something like that to speak, but that's what we have. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether you want to address only one question or you would like to try to say something about both. But I will intervene and let you know when we're at 2 minutes and try to move things to the next. Is that fair, or does anybody want to propose something different? Okay, great. Here's the first question. How can university faculty unions better support and advocate for academic freedom while also resisting hate speech? And here's the second question. It's touched on in different ways by different presenters, but I wanted to give everybody a chance to think this through as beautifully as it's stated here. Can the panelists speak to the importance of thinking about Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Semitism as interlocking oppressions, and the importance of this solidarity work in the current political moment? Both big, important questions, both deserving of other panels entirely. And I'm telling you, you have 2 minutes. This is unfair. Would anybody like to volunteer to go first? We could go back and start with Dalia, but I don't want to put you in the spot, Dalia, if you want. You ready?
No, it's okay. I will be very brief. Which question do you want to start with?
No, it's up to you. You can choose, you can address both, or you can choose one. It's up to you.
So when it comes to your first question and the hate speech, I think it's reframing what hate speech is defined as, and not weaponizing certain terms as, or defining them as hate speech. I think that's important especially in the post-secondary context, but in all contexts really. And I touched upon it a bit with definitions of intifada, or from the river to the sea, and specifically to this topic. And I will, when it comes to interlocking oppressions, absolutely, that's what this panel is about. There, you can't advocate and fight for one group without the other. They're all connected. But I think, again, those 2 questions are connected to me in terms of what defines a lot of the definitions. And my amazing colleagues today spoke so eloquently and so well about a lot of definitions. So I think it really does boil down to that.
Nice, thank you. And I appreciate you bringing the questions together as well in a way that I actually hadn't seen. Thanks, Talia. Dr. Zine.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll just speak to the interlocking oppression one, because that's something that came up a lot when I've been doing my research on Islamophobia, where I would find issues that I think actually resonate when we're talking about anti-Semitism and also anti-Palestinian racism, which is more closely aligned to Islamophobia. But for example, in my book, I talk about the idea of the folk devil and the moral panics, right, that are created around Muslims in this period. But those same moral panics and folk devils have been Jews in the past. In history, when I was looking at the Islamophobia industry and some of the conspiracy theories about Muslims, the sort of global takeover that Muslims are conspiring to do, and they've created this sort of, Islamic boogeyman that is going to overtake the West and has this mass conspiracy, is not unlike the, Jewish conspiracy theory of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so there are many similarities, and I think if we can begin to address some of those and tackle common enemies like white nationalists, right, that are, equally after Muslims as they are, anti-Semitic, I think there's some common ground there.
Thank you. Dr. Nestle?
Yeah, I guess I'll try and take on the first question. How to advocate for academic freedom while resisting hate speech. One of the things that has struck me about the last 5 months is how angry people are. People are really angry, and they are expressing it in ways that are sometimes scary and hateful to the other side. I think we have to be very cognizant of people's feelings in terms of their anger, and which doesn't excuse certain expressions that can be hateful. But I think, one of the things we need to do is sort out, what is actual hate speech from what is not. And I think, obviously Alejandro spoke to that in terms of distinguishing between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So, I mean, just sorting out what kinds of, because we're up against the the anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism industry, to kind of take a page out of Jasmine's book there, that wants us to believe a particular way. So I think one of the things that's been really important, certainly for Alejandro and myself in our work with the Jewish Faculty Network, is to make the Jewish voice a lot stronger, to counter some of the highly weaponized discourses that are thrown around, and just to keep doing it over and over and over again. But also I think people need to check themselves, they need to check their speech at the door. I mean, there have been things that I've heard at demonstrations and in other places that make me cringe, and worry me. If people are yelling, all settlers back to where you came from, and we're standing on, on stolen land here, it's like, what does that even mean? So let's try and, you can't, it's very hard to to have a slogan that's going to make a lot of sense, because speaking in slogans is not a really productive way of communicating. I think there needs to be more picking apart the weaponization of anti-Semitism. I think that would be really helpful. And continue, and we have to protect. I think Canadian academia has been very brave in defending, academic freedom. The CAUT, and Jasmine and I worked on this, spent a lot of time working on getting CAUT to come up with a unanimous decision not to adopt the IHRA. And just keeping that moving, because the suspension of academic freedom is a very scary thing in my mind. But I think, and there are new things coming down the pike at us. There's a bill coming up at 166 in Ontario, where they're proposing that, the provincial legislature be able to mandate what kinds of, the way hate is regulated on college campuses and university campuses. And this is very, very scary and very threatening. And, we cannot allow these kinds of things to move forward. So we have to move together. And I think just one more thing, that the coalitions that we have put together in this struggle have been incredibly effective. They speak to the ability to work together. They speak to the fact that we are not, in conflict with one another as, ethnic groups or whatever. And that has to continue. So, I was talking to somebody today and I said, we have to wait. What's the day after going to look like? And the day after has to be the continuation of these alliances and, moving them forward to take on new things. So that I could go on and on, but I won't. But thanks for asking that question.
Thanks, Dr. Nessel. I mean, that's a lot of a strong basis on which to people that are watching to continue having these conversations. Thank you. Dr. Paz.
I'm just going to underline what the other panelists have said in one kind of sentence. I mean, it's only by creating these kinds of networks, by creating these kinds of coalitions, that there's any way to move forward in Palestine and Israel. There's really no other way. It's only by creating trust, by tackling anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism together, that we can have the kinds of complicated discussions which Cheryl just mentioned and which Dalia and Jasmine have talked about as well. So it really is this kind of panel. It really is. It doesn't have to be a public panel. It really is reaching out and finding those people who are going to speak to you and who will have trust in you and who you can work together to fight, as Dalia put it, the colonial origins of this conflict. Until we don't, we're going to end up over and over again in that horrible situation that we are in right now. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the audience as well.
Thank you. That concludes tonight's webinar. I have been really honored to participate. The depth of experience, the range of research, the rigor of theoretical analysis, and the connections drawn from one speaker to the next has really been exemplary of what coalition building, politically engaged academic work can be. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for the contribution that you've made to Laurier. It's huge and helpful here. Thank you to our campus and our community sponsors, and to everyone who helped to organize and support the event. And picking up on what Alejandro has just said, as we're looking ahead to continue the work that we are involved in tonight, there are many groups and campaigns to join, participate in. But before we depart, I just want to name one, and that is that on Wednesday, March 27th, from 6 to 8 p.m., iftar provided, there will be an in-person panel at the University of Waterloo titled Understanding Scholasticide. There are 3 excellent speakers that will discuss scholasticide in Gaza and its reverberations in Canadian universities. This event is organized by the Faculty for Palestine Southwest Ontario chapter. Admission is free, and you can reserve tickets through Eventbrite now. I believe the link has just been put in the chat box. Thank you to everyone, especially to our panelists, and good night.